Did you think it was over?
Revolves my shadow, fans my blade. Death at my hands is an honor. Were you expecting me?
Hey guys, I hope all is well. This is Starlight Blade, and I'm here once again with another off-meta build in Diablo 4 Season 9. So, for the longest time, I wanted to make this build, and I'm pretty happy that I finally got it done. And this is basically pure Phys crit damage Flurry. And the build was inspired by Warcraft 3's Maiev Shadowsong or Dota 2's Phantom Assassin for those that play either game. Shout out to you guys for knowing the reference that I'm trying to make here. Anyways, basically, Shadowsong has an ability called Fan of Knives, which is pretty close to how Flurry looks in Diablo 4, and I just thought, there you go. That's the one. That's the build. And Shadowsong has like a blink strike element to her, a kind of stealth or evasive side to her, and she specializes in crit damage. So to mimic all that, I've got Shadow Step and improved Flurry to mimic the blinking around, and my Shadow Clone, which is totally objectively irrelevant, grants me stealth and evasiveness. And I've stacked a bunch of crit damage, and I think I'm over 2k, which honestly isn't a lot, I know, but that's okay because it was enough. Because the build took me all the way through the endgame and deleted a bunch of tier 4 bosses, which was actually very satisfying and surprising. You want to know why it was surprising? Because this build does less damage than my previous build, Snow White, which was doing upwards of 6.4 billion damage, and I think this one only does upwards of like 1 to 2 billion from what I've seen so far. Like, once I get all my buffs going and all that, yet it was still able to do what my previous, honestly, better build couldn't do. And that to me suggests that the developers are definitely doing changes to bosses without being fully transparent about it, as far as I can tell. Which, on one hand, is pretty good because that means this season you don't really need an S tier build to actually enjoy doing tier 4 bosses, which is actually so good. But on the other hand, it is pretty annoying because, yeah, they don't tell us these things. But whatever, I'll certainly take the win. I'm very happy that I was able to do what I did, and I definitely prefer it this way, speaking as a very casual player who has a day job and works like 50 hours a week and is married. This change to the bosses is definitely a step in the right direction, and it definitely earns some points in my book. As far as the playstyle of the build is concerned, basically the way to play this build is to just build up the damage multiplier buffs and then just spam Flurry. And we're able to spam Flurry without worrying about resources because of the new Deathmask unique helm that makes it so when you run out of resource, Flurry will consume life as your resource and do up to 100% times increased damage, which is insane. Then I just added in some healing elements to maintain my health pool efficiently so I can endlessly cast Flurry and get the 100 times multiplier and basically never die for the most part. And honestly, it works pretty damn well. And the damage multipliers I'm running are from Enhanced Smoke Grenade, Enhanced Caltrops, Shadow Step, which triggers Dance Macrobee, Puncture into Flurry, which triggers Close Combat and Tricks of the Trade, and casting Shadow Clone, which triggers Vehement Brawler. The rest of the multipliers are pretty passive through that I got from the passives from the skill tree and multipliers to staggered or crowd controlled mobs. Alright, so moving on to gear and stuff. For my helm, like I said, I'm running Deathmask. I got very lucky with this one with the highest damage multiplier, but ideally you'll also want at least a greater affix into Flurry as well as times 100% damage. I've also put in 2 skulls to make my healing more comfortable. For my chest, I've just focused on getting a greater affix into Dark Shroud for the damage reduction, and I've put Undying aspects on it for the amazing healing capabilities of the aspect. If you aren't running this, you'll definitely notice a difference on how well you're healing back your life. I've also tempered it with Flurry size and healing for quality of life and healing comfort. And I'm running Tam and Mott runes to give me Dark Shrouds very easily, and I'm pretty much always at max Dark Shroud stacks, which is kind of nice and comfortable there. For my gloves, I'm running Twist of Fate, which I wasn't running until the very end of the build, and that's because it can just make your damage insane. And I've tested it many times with gloves like regular legendary gloves that gave me +6 flurry, crit damage, and a damage multiplier aspect, and Twist of Fate was still giving me way more damage. And these gloves are pretty much what pushed my damage from hundreds of millions into the 1 to 2 billion territory, which was just amazing and again insane. The downside is pretty much like a third of the time your damage will be bad, but 2/3 of the time your damage will either be doubled or tripled, which was a pretty good trade-off to me, I'll say. For my legs, I'm just running tacits to fill out stats and resistances, and a bunch of movement speed for quality of life, and I'm running Pock with Vex to give me more ranks to Flurry for more damage. For my boots, I'm running Penitent Greaves just for the damage multiplier and the free chill. I honestly didn't even bother getting greater affix on it or even fully masterworking it because it's just unnecessary. Don't even bother. For my amulets, I got extremely lucky because I found this amulet with a greater affix on Frigid Finesse and a percent dex roll. Then I crafted the third affix to get a +2 exploit. Then I masterworked it to get +6 Frigid Finesse, which is absolutely insane because that's times 90% damage to frozen enemies. Again, that's absolutely insane. I've also put aspect of Encircling Blades tempered with Flurry healing and damage per Dark Shroud, and I've also put the Starflux seasonal gem to boost the damage of my Disintegrate seasonal power, which is pretty much just a beam that does damage and CCs if enemies stand in it. For my first ring, I've got Cold Clip on a crit ring with a bit of Shadow Clone cooldown reduction, and I've got the Will Breaker seasonal gem because that times 40% Phys damage looks pretty juicy, honestly. And for my second ring, I'm running good old reliable Ring of Starless Skies for the times 50% damage and boost to Flurry ranks. And I've got the Liminal Echo seasonal gem, which basically, if you die, it prevents your death and grants you immunity to all damage for 3 seconds with a 75-second cooldown. Honestly, for general non-bossing, this is unnecessary, but if you're doing bosses or trying to push higher into the pit, it can definitely save your life or save the run. Honestly, it saved me from a lot of one-hit KO death mechanics, and I'd highly recommend keeping it on as a failsafe because dying just sucks. You gotta go all the way back. You just lose time, and for pits, you just lose potential upgrades. It's just not worth it. For my two-handed, I'm using a crossbow because I couldn't find a good bow, but ideally you'd want a breakneck banded aspect on a bow because the bow has crit damage, with a greater affix on at least crit damage. Then I tempered it with damage per Dark Shroud and Flurry double damage. And ignore my gems, don't use rubies. This was when I was testing an overpower version of the build. Long story short, not worth it. Please just use emeralds and stick to focusing on crit damage for this build. For my one-handed weapons, you're definitely going to want to use swords for the crit damage, and you're going to want a greater affix on crit damage, and you're going to want to put emeralds in it. So for my first sword, I've got Frostbitten aspect, and it's tempered with extra flat fizz to help boost overall damage because that's what scales really well with the crit damage, and it's tempered with damage per Dark Shroud. On my second sword, I've got Vehement Brawler's aspect, and it's tempered with damage per Dark Shroud and Flurry double damage. And lastly, for my rogue specialization, I'm running Preparation for the cooldown reduction to Shadow Clone because having Shadow Clone almost always active is a huge boost in DPS overall because it's pretty much mimicking my damage for a fraction of the amount. So for leveling, it's kind of hard to follow the build exactly without the Deathmask. So until then, I'd focus on getting more resource generating elements into the build because you can't really spam Flurry like that early on. But I will say I did get lucky and I found a Deathmask really early on before I even hit level 60, so I can't give advice based off personal experience. But if I didn't, then yeah, I'd most likely try to find a better way to sustain my energy until then. Also, while leveling, I used Dash instead of Smoke Grenade, and I ran Dark Shroud on my action bar instead of Caltrops because I didn't have good enough crit for the Umbrus aspect, and obviously didn't have the runes to sustain it, so you can skip Smoke Grenade and Caltrops until then. Other than that, you can pretty much follow the build as is, and honestly, leveling as a rogue in Diablo 4 nowadays really isn't hard. They just give you so much free stuff, and it's a very smooth leveling experience. And I know it can get tedious to level a new character, but once you hit level 60, that's when things get kicked up a notch because you get access to Paragon, access to high tiers of difficulty, and access to bosses and hell tides where you can pretty much farm your gear. And honestly, the new Nightmare Dungeon stuff like the strong rooms, I think is so good because it adds flavor to the dungeons, and that's exactly what this game needs more of to keep things interesting, in my opinion, of course. Alright, so just to go over my skill tree real quick, I start with Puncture, and I do end up going Fundamental Puncture just because it's very consistent with making enemies vulnerable, especially bigger enemies. And then I obviously, max Flurry. So with the gloves that I mentioned earlier, I was at like 20 Flurry, and the max I think I've gotten was like 21. But even at rank 14 Flurry with the Fist of Fate, I'm so sorry, I know I've been saying this wrong this whole time. The Fist of Fate, with rank 14 Flurry versus a regular pair of gloves with like rank 21 Flurry, the Fist of Fate is actually way better, way more damage overall. So it's only if you get a high roll, of course, but just to keep that in mind. And then obviously, we go improved flurry because of the healing capabilities. I did try out advanced flurry because of the extra times 30% damage, but it's not as good. And because you just get so much mobility with the improved flurry, it's just far superior compared to this like little damage boost here. Obviously, for passives, we get target practice for the increased crit chance. We get sturdy for the damage reduction, and then siphoning strikes is a must. And then down here, we get shadow step into methodical shadow step for the damage reduction. And like I mentioned, while leveling, I was using dash. I didn't even get any of these points. I just had like just dash by itself. And once you get higher levels and you can drop off dash, then I would get the caltrops into the methodical caltrops. Specifically when you're trying to target farm bosses, that's when you don't really need the second dash or the second mobility thing. Technically, you have 3 mobility options. You have Flurry, Shadow Step, and Dash. 3 is absolutely unnecessary. I would stick with Shadow Step because it does give you the damage reduction overall. And then the Caltrops itself does give you the Chill, which builds Stagger, and the times damage up to 45 times, which is really good. I have 2 ranks into Rugged just to protect myself from damage over time ground effects, like let's say for Zir or Duriel's poison, etc., whatever. Especially for Lilith's stupid, like when she draws you in and pulls you closer like a black hole. That does poison you, which is very annoying. And just for general mapping, it's general dungeoning, whatever. It's very convenient to have like some sort of protection from damage over time effects. Then we have weapon masteries, pretty stable. Unstable elixirs, pop your health potion, get times 18 damage, pretty legit for 10 seconds. Trick attacks, and then Balestra. I think that's a new one. The name I haven't heard of that. Maybe I just haven't been paying enough attention. But yeah, this isn't the best compared to the others in terms of the passive multiplication boost because it only lasts for 4 seconds. So I do all of my other. I activate all my other multiplication buffs first, and then I evade at the end because that will last the shortest. So yeah, you gotta do it in like a certain order like that. Because if you're evading first, then you're just gonna while you're amping yourself up with your other buffs, then your Balestra boost is just gone. So you want to do the evade last. Dark Shroud for the damage reduction into subverting Dark Shroud because of the healing. You don't really need the extra crit, whatever. Smoke Grenade into enhanced for the times 25 damage, and then Malice, and then Exploit, really good. All staple over here. Frigid Finesse, like I said, rank 9, 90 times damage, absolutely amazing. And then we have our Shadow Clone, which is doing 64% of my damage. So if Shadow Clone did 100% of my damage, then my damage would be literally doubled. But this is literally 64% more damage. I think it's really good compared to like Death Trap or Rain of Arrows, obviously. Especially since Shadow Clone can also, build Stagger as well. While I'm attacking, so that's kind of nice as well. And then, of course, it does also make me unstoppable, so I can get out of like freeze effects. I can protect myself from getting drawn in by Lilith's black hole effect. It's actually really good. And then this also gives me 20% damage reduction, which is also really nice. And then Aftermath is very nice for a passive healing effect. And then over here, I have second wind for the barrier. And then lastly, I have close quarters combat for the times 90% damage. All right, and then moving on to my Paragon. For the starting board, oh crap. Anyways, for the starting board, I have control. I was actually playing around a lot with where I was putting my glyphs, and the boards I pretty much chose and finalized as it was, because I thought these were the best legendary nodes that gave me the most amount of times damage possible. But I was playing around a lot with the glyphs, and I think ultimately this is probably one of the more optimal setups out there. So first board I have control, because it's very easy to get the int nodes on the way, and I try to build my boards as along the way as possible. As you can see, I'm not venturing out too much. Second board, I have Tricks of the Trade, because I use Puncture to make them vulnerable, and then I spam Flurry. It triggers Tricks of the Trade, very easy to work with. And then I have Chip, because it gets a lot of these dex nodes along the way. You don't even have to get this, which is marksman damage, pretty useless. But Chip is actually pretty good here. And then on my third board, I have Exploit Weakness for the times 25 damage. And then for this board, I have Pride for the boost to rare nodes. So I'm getting 98% increased damage from this rare node, 147% damage increased to at least from this node. It's actually really nice. And then the strength nodes are also like along the way, so it's not too bad. For my fourth board, I have Dance Maccabi for times 30% damage every time I use Shadow Step. So that's really nice. It lasts for 10 seconds. And then I have Combat for the insane amount of times crit damage. I have 241.6% from just this alone. And then all of these int nodes are like kind of along the way as well. And then for my last board, I pretty much went all out into getting all of these as much rare nodes as I thought was useful. And I have last board ultimately is Cheap Shot for the times 25% increased damage, and Devious for the boost to the like magic nodes here, 27.4 over there, a bunch of those over there, and then 48% to crowd controlled. Those are actually also really good as well. And then plus it gives me some like stats here and there, so that's not too bad. And also it's very along the way picking up the requirement for the stat requirements for this glyph as well, because ultimately you do come here and get the time plus 50% damage to healthy enemies. Over here it's plus 70% damage to crowd controlled. Here is 40% damage, 70% damage to crowd control. This is a very DPS heavy board, and down here I just got this at the end, which is just some life. Pretty much that's it. And I was for a long time having to use a plus 60 to all stats incense, until I got a 4GA Tacit to boost my int and my strength to get these additional bonuses. But eventually you will fill out your stats, so you'll be able to drop that incense and maybe use something else. And that's it for the Paragon board. If anyone has a more optimal setup, please let me know. I'm always experimenting, I'm always trial and erroring. I just think this is what's best for now, until someone can please guide me into a better direction here. So there you have it. This is the farthest I've ever taken a build in Diablo 4. I think it's the first time I actually got a character past 200 Paragon actually, but it was worth it because the build did exactly what I wanted it to. And before I show the Lilith fight, which I did in tier 3 because tier 4 Lilith is still straight up doo-doo from the anus, I tried to fight in tier 4, which is definitely doable, but it's slower obviously. And the Lilith fight is still bugged because for some reason in the first phase, when she spawns ads, after killing them, usually they spawn blood boils, right? But they kind of just exploded into health potions, which honestly I'm a huge fan of this bug because it's actually a pretty good bug, because I can spam health potions to trigger alchemical advantage without worrying about depleting them. But it only happened to me once, which kind of sucks, but other than that, the fight is pretty standardly abhorrent. Anyways, here's the actual Lilith kill. Hope you guys enjoy. See you guys next time.